And from the fabulous room 1065, it's the Kelvin Dueck Show of Science. And we're live.
Here we go. I prepared this on the weekend and I just got depressed. But this is important because sadly, my generation is messing this up and we're passing the problem on to you. So the least we can do is educate you about the problem if we're not going to bother fixing it. It's called the effects of bioaccumulation on ecosystems, and we need to start out by defining the word. So the word bioaccumulation is the gradual buildup of chemicals in living organisms. Bio, living, biology. Accumulation, when stuff accumulates, it builds up. Living organisms, they absorb it from their surroundings as they eat and live. And depending on what they absorb, some of it, Amber, when it enters life forms, doesn't react with anything in their body, and so it just builds up and it builds up and it builds up. And as an example, some people don't eat some types of seafood because it's too high in mercury. You may have heard that. Our body has no way of metabolizing mercury. Processing it. So it simply builds up in our body, and when it builds up beyond a certain point, it starts doing nasty damage. Well, we're not the only life creatures on Earth that deal with this. Okay? Now, some stuff that we intake, our body processes no problem. And we either metabolize it or we get rid of it through excreting it. We're fine. No problem. Sugar. You can eat lots of sugar, you'll get hyper. Believe me, no matter what your parents say, it won't kill you. You can eat a lot of sugar. It can do health damage eventually and diabetes and all that stuff, but your body processes that. Protein. Your body processes most proteins, but there are many things out there that life forms cannot. So it can be harmful if it doesn't either get used up or pass through the system. The chemicals can simply build up in their bodies, and then they can start to interfere with chemical reactions that occur in the body. They can cause birth defects and failure to reproduce. If you want a depressing picture in your textbook, page 92. You don't have to open it up, but you'll see a three-legged frog. Okay, page 92. Okay. We are finding right now that, by the way, what family of animals do frogs belong to? Begins with the letter A. Amphibians. What are amphibians? What makes an animal an amphibian? Okay, it can live and usually breathe underwater as well as air, and that makes the amphibians extremely sensitive to harmful bioaccumulation, because if you have stuff accumulating on land, they're living there. If you got stuff accumulating in water, they're also living there. So we're finding across our planet, frogs in particular, are suddenly starting to go extinct. Many, many frogs, I think it's 1/3 of the species of frogs around the planet, are endangered or going extinct, and we don't know why. We think it's because amphibians are extremely sensitive to changes, to harmful changes in the environment, as is evidenced by that kind of disturbing picture on page 92. So, how do we know that bioaccumulation is occurring? We have something called a keystone species. This is a species that can greatly affect population numbers in an entire ecosystem. As an example, BC salmon. Because if something goes wrong with BC salmon, there are so many other life forms that depend on the salmon for food, and so many other life forms that depend on the animals that depend on the salmon for food, and that can domino all the way up. So here's the key question. Supposing a keystone species takes in a lot of contaminant, what would happen to the other organisms higher up on the food chain? If a salmon has a tiny bit of mercury, enough Kenzie that it can survive, what's going to happen as we move up the food chain? Well, an eagle comes along. Is it only going to eat one salmon? No, it will probably eat 50 over the course of a year. Well, now instead of just having one amount of mercury, how much mercury will the eagle have ingested? 50 times that much. Oh, and then the eagle gets eaten by something else, and that something else eats several eagles. What now? We have this process where the further you go up the food chain, the higher you go up the trophic levels, the more concentrated these get. So we call that process bio for life. What's the fancy word for when you zoom in on something and begins with the letter M? We call it biomagnification. The process where as you move up trophic levels, these harmful chemicals become more and more concentrated, because if one salmon has only a tiny bit of mercury, that's fine, but if something eats 50 salmon, it's got all that, okay, and that something eats that, it builds up. Short little video for you on biomagnification. Put your pencils down and look. By the way, what does ppm stand for? Do you guys know? They used that term in the video we just saw. Parts per million. If you looked at 1 million molecules, how many of them would be in this toxin? So if something, for example, is 3 parts per million, we're saying that if you picked 1 million molecules randomly, on average, you'd find 3 molecules of this chemical. What's worse? What's more dangerous? 10 parts per million or 1 part per million? Well, it depends on whether you're talking about amount or toxicity. The more toxic something is, the less of it you need to be deadly. The more toxic something is, the less of something you need to be deadly. So if something is toxic at 2 parts per million, it's more toxic than something that is toxic at 3 parts per million, because for this second chemical, you need 3 of them to do the same damage as you only need 2 of them in the first chemical. There's a little table there showing you the accumulation of DDT. We're going to talk about DDT in a bit in the food chain. ppm, parts per million, is also used to show how concentrated a contaminant is in a plant or animal. Take a guess. If ppm stands for parts per million, what do you think ppb stands for? Yeah, parts per billion. Oh, and if you're talking toxicity, that's even more deadly than parts per million, because if it's deadly at parts per billion, you barely need any of it, and it's toxic. So you need to understand ppb and ppm. They will use those on the provincial. I will use those on your test. And I think you will all turn the page. So let's go local. One of the animals, one of the species that we are very proud of here on the coast of BC are orcas. What used to be called killer whales, but they're terribly misnamed, and that caused people to kill killer whales thinking they were evil. We call them orcas. Beautiful. And have you seen one live? Aside from the aquarium, and have you seen one live in the wild? It's quite awe-inspiring. I've seen it a couple of times. Be a great field trip, but not for us. Too much money. So we need to talk about PCBs, which everyone knows are polychlorinated biphenyls. Say what? PCBs. It's a chemical that's used in paints, plastic, lubricants, etc. If they enter living creatures at a sufficient concentration, they suppress the immune system, and they are carcinogenic. What does carcinogenic mean? Cancer causing. Well, we have been allowing PCBs to enter the environment, and Sarah, there's a problem with that. The PCBs have a long half-life. Remember that term. It takes a long time for them to decay. They've been banned since 1977. But they're going to continue to affect orcas until at least 2030, at least. Orcas are long-lived. They live 30 and 40 years sometimes. And so where do they, first of all, how do they accumulate PCBs? Well, they eat salmon. And the salmon have eaten smaller fish, and the smaller fish have eaten plankton, and some of those PCBs have entered the system. Hayden, you with me? You sure? Okay, just making sure, my friend. You're alive, you're alert? Okay. So, orcas are long-lived. They accumulate lots of PCBs. In fact, the PCB load of orcas is much higher than that of any other animal on the planet. When an orca eats 5 kilograms of salmon, it's ingesting PCBs and other pollutants from about 4,500 kilograms of microscopic plants and algae. You can see this is what we mean by bioaccumulation, Curtis. As you move up trophic levels, it gets more and more concentrated because they might have enough that it doesn't, they might have so little PCBs in their system that they can live a normal life, but now it gets concentrated more and more and more and more. So we're studying orcas, seeing how that goes. Then there's something what are called persistent organic pollutants, also called POPs, POPs. These are carbon-containing compounds. They remain in soil for many years. And then we have the creepy one, DDT. This is a controversial one, and I'll try and give you a balanced view if I can. Sarah, DDT stands for dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethene, DDT. It's a pesticide. Well, no, it's an insecticide. It was introduced in 1941 to kill disease-carrying mosquitoes, and at the time, people thought it was the wonder insecticide. If you go to YouTube, you'll find old black and white commercials where they're manufacturing, I kid you not, DDT-based wallpaper and DDT-based paint so that you can paint your child's nursery with it because that'll kill the bugs. Perhaps the scariest video I'll ever show you right now. So it was introduced in 1941. Although it's now banned in many countries, has a long half-life. It persists in the environment. One of the big effects it has is it makes eggshells of birds much, much more brittle, so that when the birds sit on the eggs break. And so it was really decimating bird populations. Fair enough. But who likes mosquitoes? Not me. It's a balance. It stays in the soil for as long as 15 years. Stays for a while. See commercial? I already showed you the commercial. What else do we have? Heavy metals, not the musical genre. Heavy metals don't degrade within the biosphere. These are some of the worst ones because the other ones that I've told you about, I've used words like half-life, decay, 30-year. Eventually, if we stop, eventually they'll take care of themselves. The earth can cycle them and break them down. Heavy metals don't degrade, and they can't be destroyed, at least as far as we know with no current technology right now. 3 are the most common. Lead. You and I are old enough to remember leaded gasoline. Okay, they went from leaded to unleaded gasoline in the mid-'80s, and it was a huge controversy. In fact, the scientist behind it was so hugely discredited for a number of years. They ruined his career, but finally he was able to show, look, this lead that's entering the atmosphere, it doesn't bond with anything in our bodies, but when we ingest it, most of it accumulates in our brains and doesn't do good stuff. There was lead-based paints. So it's generally present in all soil, normally at about 15 parts per million to 40 parts per million. However, This has increased due to us. Lead was once used in insecticides. Was once used in lead-based paint, still is in some countries. And if you're buying an older house, a house that's more than 30 years old, you better be prepared to go look for that, and you don't want that in your house, because little infants were notorious because kids kind of put their mouth on everything. They would ingest some of the paint, and your body does not break it down. Once it's in your body, it's there. It was once used in leaded gasoline. Still used in electronics, so please recycle your phones. Hayden. Assuming you break a phone again. In our bodies, it's toxic at a very, very low level. It's not toxic at 1 part per million. It's not toxic at 0.1 parts per million. It is toxic at 0.0012 parts per million. You don't need much before it starts doing damage. And you may have heard some of this already. You may have heard about lead-based paints. Certainly it was a huge controversy in the 80s, the switch from leaded gasoline to unleaded gasoline. They had to completely change how engines, well, not completely change. They had to change a little bit how engines worked. It wasn't as big a controversy as they wanted to make out. The car companies just didn't want to change. Yep.
What about lead pipes?
Lead pipes, which is why they're slowly replacing those with PCVs, but yeah, or PVC pipes.
But now PVC pipes are bursting.
Yep. So we're still working on it. Lead, the next one, cadmium. Also on your periodic table. Just below zinc. Cadmium is found in the Earth's crust, and it's released into the environment through rock weathering, volcanoes, and forest fires. It's also released in the manufacture of plastics and NiCad batteries. By the way, what do you think the CAD stands for in NiCad batteries? Cadmium. What do you think the Ni stands for? Think another element? Yeah, nickel cadmium. That's the main chemical reaction that's going on in those. Now, we've slowly started to replace nickel cadmium batteries with lithium-based ones, but that's another issue. In fact, probably 15 years from now, I may be adding another metal to this list. Who knows? Chemically, they are attracted to organic matter in the soil. Then they're absorbed by plants, eaten by grazing animals, which are eaten by other animals, which are eaten by other. They work their way up the trophic level, getting more and more concentrated the entire time. In fact, there is a particular type of plant that's extremely receptive to this. And sorry, this is to those of you who still smoke. Tobacco plants are extremely receptive to this process. Not only are you having issues with the tobacco itself, but often you're ingesting cadmium that was absorbed by the tobacco plants. Cadmium remains in the kidneys and bone tissues with a half-life of 30 years. So after 30 years, your body would only have gotten rid of about half of it. After 60 years, which basically is most of your life, your body still has 1/4 of it. It's a nasty. The third metal, you may have heard of this one. Mercury. Now, Mercury is on the periodic table, and it does occur in nature. In fact, about 6,000 tons each year enters the environment from natural processes. Amy, you with me? You want to face the front and focus? Thank you, dear. So about 6,000 tons each year enters the environment from natural processes, but then we come along. In the past 150 years, we've doubled it. From where? Fossil what? Fuels. There's one source. One of the reasons we have catalytic converters in cars now is to deal with some of this. It's not perfect, but it's better. Where else? Mining. Mercury is used to separate all sorts of other minerals, but then you have this sludge, this slag of very toxic stuff. You got to put it somewhere. For the longest time, it was just dumped into the ground, and it ended up in the groundwater. We're a little better now. We've kind of clued in. Hey, maybe we should dump it into a tank. Hey, those tanks leak. Hey, maybe we should. But mercury it's a tough metal to deal with. Also used in batteries, so recycle them. Coal deposits. Actually, not coal deposits. Nice try. Coal burning releases large amounts into the atmosphere. Miller, we don't deal with that as much here in BC because we don't get our electricity from burning coal. Where do we get most of our electricity from? Hydroelectric. We have that advantage. But hey, as soon as you cross the Rocky Mountains, you head to the prairies and you head out east, they got coal burning plants everywhere. That's where they get most of their power from. And as environmentally gung-ho as I am, I like my electricity and my tech toys, so I need that power. There's another one that's going to become an issue probably. Thank you. These light bulbs and the screw-in kind that they're replacing the incandescent ones with, those have mercury and need to be disposed of properly. So the new fluorescent bulbs that are replacing the incandescent ones, don't just toss them in the trash, please. It affects the nervous systems, especially the brain. You may have heard the expression, oh, he's mad as a hatter. It's an older expression. Based on the fact that 100, 200 years ago, felt hats had a mercury coating, and so the hatters that were making them were ingesting mercury without knowing it, and many of them went loopy, went insane. Why? Because it stays in your brain. That's the depressing part. Almost 4 pages. Here's the cheerful part. 1 paragraph. Best I got. How can we reduce the effects of chemical pollution? This is the new science, Kenzie, that we are trying to invent and trying to propagate. It's called bioremediation. A remedy is a cure, bio, life. We're trying to find ways to use living organisms, usually microscopic ones, that feed on some of these chemicals naturally and process them and turn them maybe into less harmful versions, or maybe get rid of them altogether, bond with them, and we can then do something. So the idea is convert harmful substances into harmless or less harmful, ideally. That's chapter 2. What do you need to know? I did a little summary here. So this chapter looked at cycling. First of all, we looked at cycling energy through ecosystems. You need to know how to make a food chain, 10% of available to the next trophic level. We looked at cycling nutrients. You need to know the 3 cycles, the phosphorus, the carbon, the nitrogen. And by know, I mean, Laura, you need to be able to read those charts. They're not the simplest. They're kind of complicated, but you study them, you can figure stuff out. And then today we looked at how toxins are cycled. Sadly, toxins are mostly cycled in and not really cycled out. Know the differences between bioaccumulation and biomagnification, what parts per million means, what the major contaminants and problems are. I wrote here page 90 and 102 are testable, so read them, they are interesting. Read them, they are interesting. What's your homework? First of all, the homework from last day, and I'm going to give you another one today, and you got the rest of class to work on it.